The Baal negotiation began on a Tuesday. Jack had been avoiding it since month 2, not through any failure of nerve, because Jack O'Neill had walked through the event horizon toward things that would have stopped most soldiers before they reached the ramp, and the concept of fear as an operational deterrent had ceased to apply to him somewhere around year 3 of his SGC career. He had been avoiding it through the specific mechanism of a commanding general who understood that some negotiations required the other party to arrive at the table by their own momentum rather than by invitation, and that the art of the thing was knowing when the momentum had reached its peak and the table was the natural next destination. Baal arrived at the natural next destination on a Tuesday morning, through the gate, alone, in a tailored suit that had absolutely no business existing in a Goa'ul's wardrobe, and that Jack immediately clocked as a deliberate performance of a specific kind of studied reasonableness. "General O'Neill," Baal said, at the base of the ramp, with the specific tone of a system lord who had spent 6 months recalibrating his strategic architecture and had arrived at the conclusion that the recalibration pointed here. "Baal," Jack said, from the control room window above. A pause. Baal looked around the gate room at the armed Marines, at the tactical positions, at the Spartan, in full Mjolnir armor, standing to the left of the ramp, with the specific stillness that Spartans maintained in situations that required presence rather than action. His gaze settled on the chief for 2.3 seconds, which was longer than his gaze settled on anything else. "New staff," Jack said. "I had heard," Baal said. "The rumors do not do justice to the reality." "They never do," Jack said. "Conference room B. Don't touch anything on the way." The negotiation lasted 4 days. Not 4 days of continuous conversation, 4 days of the specific architecture of serious negotiation, which meant sessions of 2 to 4 hours, followed by recesses, in which both parties processed what had been said and decided how far to move toward what the other party needed before the next session. The movement incremental and deliberate, and conducted with the patience of people who understood that the outcome was worth the time it required. Baal wanted survival, not personal survival, though that was included, but systemic survival. The Goa'uld as a biological and cultural entity, distinct from the parasitic theocracy that had expressed that entity for 10,000 years. He had been doing the mathematics since the Anubis engagement, and the mathematics were unambiguous. The Free Jaffa movement had reached irreversibility. The Substrate Stewardship Authority had delegitimized the theological architecture. The UNSC SGC alliance had introduced a military variable the remaining system lords could not model with any confidence. The Goa'uld path forward was not through continued dominance. It was through something Goa'uld had not done in recorded history: adaptation. Jack listened to all of it with the expression he maintained in negotiations, the one that communicated complete attentiveness and zero interpretable emotional response, which had taken him 3 years to develop, and which Teal'c had once described as the most tactically effective face he had ever observed on a non-Jaffa warrior. Cortana ran the technical analysis in parallel, her holographic form present at the corner of the conference table at Baal's specific request. He had asked, in the second session, whether the AI could be present, and had explained when asked why, that he had questions about the Substrate Stewardship Authority's technical scope, that the general was qualified to answer politically, but that the AI was qualified to answer accurately, and that he preferred accuracy in negotiations because surprises were expensive. Jack had looked at Cortana. Cortana had looked at Jack. "He's not wrong," she said. "She's not wrong," Jack told Baal. Baal had inclined his head toward Cortana with the specific gesture of a Goa'uld acknowledging an entity he was revising his assessment of. Cortana had noted it, without remarking on it, and answered his technical questions with the complete accuracy he had requested and the specific additional detail that complete accuracy sometimes required to prevent misunderstanding. By day 3, The negotiation had produced a framework. Not a treaty. Frameworks preceded treaties the way foundations preceded buildings, and the building was not going to be constructed in 4 days. But the framework established the SGC's formal recognition of a post-theocratic Goa'uld political entity, the Goa'uld's formal acknowledgement of the Substrate Stewardship Authority's jurisdiction over gate network infrastructure, a transition timeline for the remaining Goa'uld-controlled worlds to move toward the governance model the Free Jaffa had begun developing, and a single classified annex that Jack had insisted on including, and that Baal had, after a long pause in the 3rd session, agreed to. The annex addressed the Tok'ra. The Goa'uld Tok'ra division was 10,000 years old, the specific schism of a species split between domination and symbiosis, the two expressions of the same biology conducting the same ancient argument across a millennium of conflict. The annex did not resolve the division. It created a channel through which the division could begin to be discussed by people who had never been permitted to discuss it, in a room that the SGC maintained and the Stewardship Authority's infrastructure made accessible. Jacob Carter. Selmac had read the annex on day 4. Selmac had been quiet for a long time. Jacob had then said, very quietly, "George would have done this." "I know," Jack said. Teal'c brought the framework to Bratak through the gate on day 5, the text in Proto-Goa'uld notation that Bratak could read and that carried the specific weight of a document that represented the different political completion of an argument Bratak had been making for 40 years. Bratak read it standing up, in the SGC corridor outside the briefing room, without sitting down, without his expression changing, with the specific stillness of a warrior receiving information that exceeds the categories available for immediate response. He read it twice. Then he looked at Teal'c. 40 years, he said. "I know, Master Bratak," Teal'c said. "I did not expect to see it." "I know," Teal'c said. Bratak was quiet for a moment longer. Then his expression resolved into the specific configuration that Teal'c had learned over 30 years to recognize as the Jaffa Master's version of complete satisfaction, not triumphant, not relieved, but the deep, settled quality of a warrior whose cause has arrived at its destination and who understands that the destination is not the end, but the beginning of the harder, better work. "Then we have much to do," Bratak said. "We have always had much to do," Teal'c said. They walked toward the briefing room together. The chief read the Baal framework in the archive room on the evening of day 4. After the final session had concluded, and the gate room had processed Baal's departure with the specific procedural dignity that Jack had insisted on armed escort to the gate, formal acknowledgement at the ramp, the gate dialed without ceremony and closed without comment. Present, then not. The negotiation is complete. "Thoughts?" Cortana said. She was at the Substrate interface panel, running the monthly maintenance analysis, but her attention was distributed. "Baal is more dangerous as an ally than as an enemy," the chief said. "Yes," Cortana said. "He's also more useful." "Both things are true," the chief said. "Jack knows both things are true," Cortana said. "That's why the annex includes the Tok'ra channel. If Baal's usefulness ever tips back toward danger, the Tok'ra have the longest institutional knowledge of how to manage it." She paused. "The framework is the best available outcome given the current alignment of forces. It's not comfortable. It's correct." The chief set down the framework document. "What's the substrate showing?" Cortana's attention shifted fully to the maintenance analysis. 3 stress points resolved in the outer network from last month's repair protocols. 2 new ones in the mid-rim. One of them is significant a degradation pattern that the repair records don't have a direct analog for. She paused. "It's new. Or it's old in a way the archive doesn't document. Either way, I'm going to need Carter." "She's in Lab 3, the chief said. "I know where she is," Cortana said, with the tone she used for things that were obvious and that she was stating because the conversation invited a response, rather than because the information was needed. I'm flagging it for the morning briefing. What's your assessment of the degradation pattern? The chief said. Cortana was quiet for 1.4 seconds. The genuine analytical pause, not conversational. It's not natural wear, she said. The substrate doesn't wear the way physical infrastructure wears. This pattern is directional. Something is applying pressure to that section of the network from a specific vector. From where? The chief said. Cortana looked at him with the specific expression she used when data had arrived at a conclusion that was significant enough to require a moment before stating it. From outside the Milky Way, she said. From the direction of the Delta Quadrant. The archive room was quiet. The chief looked at the substrate interface panel, at the data Cortana was displaying. The degradation pattern rendered in the visual notation of the Foundation's architecture. The directional vector mapped against the galactic coordinate system. The Borg, he said. The classification loop has been running for 5 months, Cortana said. I documented it every month. I noted it was ongoing. I assessed it as processing. She paused. I think I was right that it was processing. I think I underestimated what processing meant for an entity with a collective substrate interaction capability. They're doing something to the network, the chief said. They're not attacking it, Cortana said precisely. The degradation pattern isn't damaged from an offensive action. She paused again, working through the most accurate characterization of data that was genuinely new. It's what happens when you push on a door, not to break it, to find out which way it opens. The archive room held that in the silence of a room where significant things had been said before, and where the significance registered in the specific quality of the air, rather than in any dramatic change of light or sound. I'll brief Jack in the morning, the chief said. I'll have the full analysis ready, Cortana said. She turned back to the substrate interface panel and continued her maintenance work, the patient, meticulous care of an archivist who understood that the most important thing about finding a new problem was not losing sight of the ongoing work while you assessed it. The Foundation required both. The specific simultaneity of maintenance and vigilance, the ordinary and the unprecedented held together in the same operational consciousness, the way the SGC had always held both, and the way the UNSC alliance had made the holding more capable, without changing the fundamental nature of what was being held. The road needed maintenance. Something was pushing on it from the Delta Quadrant. Both things were true at the same time. That was stewardship. The morning briefing on day 6 had a different quality than the briefings that had preceded it. Not in its structure, Jack ran the SGC's briefings with the same procedural consistency he had maintained since taking command, which meant start time observed, principals present, coffee available, and the specific culture of a room where people said what they actually thought, because the commanding general had built 7 years of institutional precedent, establishing that what he actually wanted was the accurate picture rather than the comfortable one. That structure held. The quality that was different was in what the briefing contained. Cortana presented the substrate degradation analysis with the methodical precision of a scientist who had spent 12 hours refining her data before presenting it and was now delivering conclusions she was confident in rather than hypotheses she was managing. The galactic coordinate map on the main display showed the degradation vector in amber, a directional pressure on the mid-rim network section, originating from Delta Quadrant space. Consistent in its application over the past 6 weeks of monitoring data that Cortana had now reanalyzed with the specific retrospective clarity of an analyst who knew what she was looking for. It started 6 weeks ago, she said. I didn't identify it as directional in the first 2 monthly analyses because the degradation was within the range of standard substrate variation. It crossed the threshold of pattern identification last night. She paused. The pattern is deliberate, not aggressive. I want to be precise about that distinction because it matters operationally. This is exploratory pressure. The collective is testing the substrate's boundary response. Testing how? Carter said. She had her tablet out, running parallel analysis, the specific, focused quality of a scientist whose data had just acquired a new dimension. The substrate has boundary properties, Cortana said. The same dimensional boundary that the slipspace rupture exploited, the one that brought infinity here, exists as a physical feature of the substrate's architecture. The UNSC built the gate network on substrate that spans that boundary. The foundation sits at the boundary's deepest accessible point. She looked at the map. The Borg have been navigating substrate-adjacent space for 300,000 years. They know the boundary exists. They have never previously interacted with it deliberately because they had no reason to and no framework for understanding what it was. She paused. They have a framework now. The engagement gave them one. The classification loop, Daniel said. The classification loop introduced the concept of the uncategorizable into the collective's operational architecture, Cortana said. An entity built on universal assimilation encountering a single exception doesn't discard the exception. It builds cognitive infrastructure around it. Over 5 months of processing, the collective has developed enough of a framework to begin experimental interaction with the thing it couldn't classify. She looked at Jack. They're not pushing on the network to damage it. They're pushing on it to find out if it responds. Jack looked at the map, at the amber vector crossing the galactic coordinate display with the specific directional precision of something deliberate. Does it respond? Yes, Cortana said. The substrate is responsive to intentional interaction. That's the fundamental principle of the gate network and the Foundation's architecture. If you engage with it purposefully, it engages back. She paused. The question is, what happens when the entity engaging with it is the Borg collective, which has a substrate interaction capability that no other civilization in either galaxy possesses, because 300,000 years of transwarp travel has given them an inadvertent depth of substrate interface experience that even the ancients didn't develop. The briefing room processed that. They're better at touching the substrate than anyone else, Jack said, because they've been doing it longer, without understanding what they were touching, Cortana said, which may have been a protection rather than a limitation. A civilization with that interaction capability and full understanding of the substrate's architecture would be, she paused, working through the accurate characterization, significant. That's one word for it, Jack said. Carter pulled the full substrate analysis by 1100 hours and had her own assessment ready for the follow-up session by 1400. It confirmed Cortana's conclusions and added a dimension that the AI's analysis had flagged but not fully developed, the specific technical finding that the Borg's exploratory pressure was not random across the Borg degradation site, but was concentrated at points in the substrate's architecture that corresponded to what Carter had begun calling, in her private notation, junction nodes. The specific structural points where the gate network's physical infrastructure interfaced with the Foundation's deeper substrate layer. The Borg were not pushing on the road. They were pushing on the points where the road connected to what was under the road. They're looking for the Foundation, Carter said in the follow-up session, with the specific flat delivery of a scientist stating a conclusion that is significant enough that adding emphasis to it would be redundant. The briefing room was quiet for a moment. Can they find it? Jack said. Not through the junction nodes, Carter said. The Foundation's address isn't accessible through the standard substrate interface. It requires the 9-symbol dial and the infinity reactor output. And even with both of those, the address only resolves because Cortana reconstructed it from dimensional rupture data and Tok'ra mythology and years of degraded ancient notation. She paused. But there's always a but, Jack said. The Tier 2 architecture, Carter said. The modification authority. The substrate repair work Cortana has been doing for 5 months. Every time we interact with the substrate at Tier 2 depth, We leave a resonance signature in the architecture. It's the equivalent of, she looked for the right metaphor. You know how you can tell a road has been maintained because the surface is consistent with the subgrade underneath it? The repair work leaves a signature of the same kind, evidence that something with deep substrate access has been here and done work. The Borg can read that signature, Cortana said. It was not a question. The Borg can read that signature, Carter confirmed. Another silence. The briefing room held the specific quality of people working through the operational implications of information that had arrived faster than the contingency planning for it. So they can't find the Foundation directly, Jack said, but they can follow the maintenance trail. Eventually, Carter said. Not quickly. The signature degrades over time, and the spatial extent of the substrate means the trail is diffuse. But given sufficient time, and the collective's distributed processing capability, she paused. Yes, eventually. Jack looked at the galactic map, at the amber vector, at the junction nodes Carter had marked in red, the points where the Borg's exploratory pressure was concentrated. He looked at them for a long moment with the expression that meant he was doing the thing he was actually best at, not the tactical assessment, not the command authority, but the specific quality of a leader who could hold an impossible situation without either minimizing it or catastrophizing it, and find the third option that neither response would have produced. Cortana, he said. Yes, she said. Can the substrate signature be modified? He said. Not removed. I'm guessing you can't remove evidence that work has been done. But changed. Made to read as something other than what it is. Cortana was quiet for 2.1 seconds. I don't know, she said. I'd need to research the Earth's archive for substrate signature management protocols. It's not something I've had reason to look for before. She paused. It's a genuinely good question. I have them occasionally, Jack said. More than occasionally, Cortana said. You simply present them as occasional to maintain a specific operational persona. Daniel made a sound that he converted into a cough. Research it, Jack said. Carter, I want the full junction node analysis mapped against the Foundation's approach architecture. Specifically, whether there's a way to reinforce the boundary response at those points without making the reinforcement itself visible. He looked around the table. This doesn't change the Baal framework timeline. It doesn't change the Jaffa transition support operations. It doesn't get briefed beyond this room until we have more than a directional pressure and a theory. He paused. What it does is go on the board as the thing we're now thinking about every morning before we think about everything else. Heads nodded around the table, the specific nods of people who had spent years learning to hold multiple operational priorities simultaneously without allowing any one of them to eclipse the others. The SGC's institutional competency was exactly this, the ability to maintain the ordinary work while the extraordinary developed at its own pace, and to treat neither the ordinary nor the extraordinary as the excuse to neglect the other. One more thing, Jack said. He looked at the chief. The ores. If the Borg are developing substrate interaction capability from deliberate engagement, is there a notification threshold? Something in the Foundation's architecture that the Earth's built to flag when an unauthorized entity begins meaningful substrate interaction? The chief looked at Cortana. I don't know yet, Cortana said, but I know where to look. She paused. And I think, based on the Earth's design philosophy across every system I've studied in 8 months of archive research, that the answer is yes. The Earth's built a foundation with monitoring capability that exceeds anything I've been able to fully map. They watched everything for 4 million years. She paused. They watched the Borg navigate the substrate for 300,000 years without flagging it as a notification threshold event, which means the threshold is not navigation. It's something more specific. Intentional engagement, Daniel said quietly. Intentional engagement, Cortana confirmed. she looked at Daniel, which started 6 weeks ago. Daniel looked at his notebook, the specific look of a linguist whose translation had just revealed a sentence with more consequences than the preceding page. "The Urs already know," he said. "Yes," Cortana said. The briefing room held that conclusion in the specific silence of a room full of people who had spent 8 months learning to trust that the Urs's awareness was a resource rather than a threat, and who were now discovering that the resource had a new dimension. The builders of the road knew when someone new had started pushing on it. The question, the one nobody in the briefing room stated aloud but everyone was thinking, was what the Urs intended to do about it. The question after that was whether their stewards were ready to do whatever needed doing alongside them. The archive room held its amber light that evening. Cortana, at the Forerunner interface panel, running the search through the Urs maintenance protocols for substrate signature management. The archive was vast, and the search was specific, and the work had the quality of all archival research. The patience required to move through what existed in order to find what was needed, without the guarantee that what was needed was there. It was there. Cortana found it at 2,147 hours. Not the exact protocol she had been searching for, but the principle that contained all possible protocols. The foundational Urs documentation of substrate signature management as a stewardship function, not a technique, a philosophy. The substrate's evidence of stewardship was not a liability to be concealed. It was a declaration. She read it twice. Then she read it again. Then she sat in the archive room's amber light for 4.2 seconds longer than any purely analytical pause, processing what the documentation implied about the situation. The collective's intentional engagement had created. She sent one message to the chief's neural interface. 4 words. "Come to the archive." He arrived in 3 minutes. She showed him the documentation. He read it with the specific focus of a soldier reading intelligence that changes the operational picture. "It's not a problem to be solved," the chief said. "No," Cortana said. "It's an invitation to be answered." Outside, the Colorado night held its stars. In orbit, infinity held its position. In the substrate, the Foundation held everything, and 4 million years of patient monitoring had noted, with the specific attention of builders watching their building do exactly what it was built to do, that the stewards had arrived at the question the third condition was waiting for them to ask. The work was not slowing down. It was deepening. The documentation read, in Cortana's proto-ancient translation, as follows. The substrate carries the evidence of all interaction with it. This is not a flaw in the architecture. It is the architecture's most deliberate feature. The road remembers every traveler. 1. The Foundation remembers every steward. The signature of maintenance is the signature of presence, and presence is not a vulnerability. It is a communication. When an entity without stewardship designation begins intentional substrate engagement, the signature of that engagement is visible to the Foundation's monitoring architecture and to the stewards who maintain it. This visibility is not an alarm. It is an introduction. The Urs did not build walls. They built doors. The difference is not structural. It is philosophical. A wall says, "You may not enter." A door says, "When you are ready, knock." The stewards do not decide who knocks. The stewards decide how to answer. Cortana had printed the translation in the SGC's standard document format, the clinical Arial typeface of military paperwork, containing the 4-million-year-old philosophical architecture of the most significant civilization either galaxy had produced, the specific collision of form and content that the SGC had been navigating since the first day Daniel Jackson had translated a proto-ancient tablet on a government-issue notepad. She had placed it in the center of the archive table. The chief had read it standing up, as he read everything the specific physical habit of a soldier for whom seated stillness was a deliberate choice rather than a default, reserved for situations that required it. He had been quiet for a long time after. They built the substrate to be findable, he said. Not immediately, Cortana said. Not by anyone. The findability is conditional on the entity doing the finding, having developed enough substrate interaction capability to begin intentional engagement, which requires, at minimum, 300,000 years of inadvertent substrate navigation, or the equivalent depth of technological development. She paused. The Urs set a threshold. The Borg just crossed it. And crossing the threshold triggers the introduction protocol, the chief said. Which means, Cortana said, that the steward's job is not to prevent the Borg from finding the Foundation. It's to be present when they do, to answer the knock. She paused. The Urs didn't leave a defensive architecture. They left a welcoming architecture with very specific entry conditions. The chief looked at the translation. At the line that had stopped him, a door says, "When you are ready, knock." The Borg aren't ready, he said. No, Cortana said, not yet. The exploratory pressure is the equivalent of circling the building, finding out it exists, mapping its exterior. She paused. But the classification loop has been running for 5 months. The collective is processing at a depth it has never previously applied to a single subject, and the Borg's processing capability distributed across a civilization of billions. She paused again. With the specific weight of an analyst stating a timeline she had calculated and found uncomfortable, and was stating anyway because accuracy was more useful than comfort. 2 years, she said. Possibly 3, before the circling becomes a knock. The archive room was quiet. Then we have 2 years to be ready to answer, the chief said. Yes, Cortana said, which is both more time than some situations have given us, and less time than this situation deserves. Jack read the translation at 0630. The following morning, alone in his office, with the first coffee of the day. In the specific way he processed information that required genuine thought, not at the briefing table with people watching his reaction, not in the control room where operational priorities could interrupt, but in the small command space of his own office, where the thinking could happen at its own pace without the performance that command authority sometimes required. He read it 3 times. Then he leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling of his underground office, the concrete and mountain above him, the gate room below, the substrate beneath that, the foundation beneath that. The Urs present in the substrate's architecture with the specific patient awareness of entities who had built this situation 4 million years ago and had been watching it develop toward this exact moment. He thought about Hammond, about the way Hammond had run the SGC for 7 years, not with the dramatic authority of a commander who needed people to know he was in charge, but with the specific quiet competence of a leader who understood that the job was to make the right decisions for the right reasons and then live with the consequences of those decisions without requiring the consequences to justify the special crimes. Decisions retroactively. Hammond would have read this translation and then called a briefing, and then asked the exact right question. Jack thought about what the exact right question was. He had it by the time he finished the coffee. The briefing at 0800 had the full principal's SG-1, the chief, Cortana, Jonas, with his notebook, Jacob Carter, who had stayed for the Baal framework completion and had not yet departed because Selmac had been running Tok'ra intelligence analysis on the substrate degradation data and had, characteristically, found something worth staying for. Jack set the translation in the center of the briefing table without preamble. Everyone read it, he said. They read it. The room had the specific quality of simultaneous reading, the different speeds and different emphases of 6 different analytical minds moving through the same text and arriving at their own first responses before the discussion. Made those responses collaborative. Daniel finished first, the linguist's advantage of reading translations in the specific way of someone who had produced them, moving through the text at the speed of comprehension rather than the speed of decoding. He set down his copy and looked at the table with the expression of a man sitting with something large. The Urs built the substrate to eventually introduce every sufficiently advanced civilization to the foundation, Daniel said. The threshold is technological depth. The mechanism is intentional substrate engagement. The trigger is the moment when a civilization stops using the road unconsciously and starts understanding that it's a road. He paused. The ancients crossed that threshold and built the gate network. The forerunners crossed it and built the halo array, which was a catastrophic misapplication of substrate principles. But the threshold crossing was genuine. The Tok'ra crossed it through symbiosis with the substrate's biological interface layer. He looked at Jacob. The Goa'uld crossed it and used it for domination, which is why the Urs threshold system includes stewards. Someone has to answer the door, and the answer matters. Jacob was quiet. Selmak's expression, the specific shift in Jacob's face that indicated the symbiote's direct engagement, carried a quality that the briefing room had learned to read as significant. Selmak says the Tok'ra have a mythology, Jacob said. Very old, pre-Ra. Karise. It describes a time before the Goa'uld's theological architecture when the symbiote-host relationship was genuinely symbiotic, the way the Tok'ra practice it. The mythology says that the substrate was given to all living things equally, and that the first civilization to claim it as divine property broke something that has not been repaired since. He paused. Selmak says this translation repairs it. The briefing room held that. The Goa'uld's claim of divinity was the corruption of the introduction protocol, Cortana said quietly. They crossed the threshold, developed genuine substrate interaction capability, and answered the door by claiming ownership of the road. She paused. The stewardship authority is the correction. The answer that should have been given 10,000 years ago. We're catching up, Jack said. We are catching up, Cortana confirmed, at considerable speed given the starting position. Jack nodded. Once, the specific nod of a commanding general acknowledging context that was useful and moving toward the operational question. So, in 2 years, give or take, the Borg knock, he said, and we answer. And the answer we give them is the most important diplomatic communication in the history of 2 galaxies. He looked around the table. What does the answer need to be? The question sat in the room in the way Jack's best questions sat, not rhetorical, not leading, genuinely open and genuinely directed at the specific people around the table who were the most qualified combination of individuals to answer it. Not a rejection, Daniel said immediately. Rejecting the introduction defeats the architecture. The Urs didn't build a door to be left closed. Not an unconditional welcome, Teal'c said. His voice carried the weight of a warrior who had spent 30 years fighting the consequences of civilizations with unchecked power encountering infrastructure they weren't ready for. The Borg Collective, in full substrate interaction capability, with full foundation access, before it has undergone sufficient individual consciousness development, he paused. That is not a welcome. That is a catastrophe prepared in advance. A conditional introduction, Carter said. She was at her tablet, working through the technical architecture of what conditional introduction would mean at the substrate level. The Foundation's access tiers the same framework we moved through. Tier 1 monitoring capability, Tier 2 modification authority only when the threshold conditions are met. She looked up. The Borg don't get modification authority on day 1. They get introduced to the road. The rest follows from that introduction, at the pace that the threshold conditions allow. The threshold conditions include stewardship function, Cortana said, returning people to themselves. That's what the Urs defined as the full expression of stewardship. She paused, and the pause carried a specific weight that the briefing room recognized. The Borg collective cannot perform stewardship function in its current form. A hive mind cannot return individuals to themselves. The mechanism of its existence is the opposite of that function. She looked at the table. But the classification loop has been running for 5 months. The concept of the uncategorizable individual is active in the collective's architecture. If that concept continues to develop, if the processing leads where processing of genuine novelty tends to lead, they might not be a hive mind in the same way in 2 years, Daniel said. No, Cortana said, they might not. The briefing room was quiet for a long moment, the silence of people sitting with a possibility so large that the instinct to reduce it to something manageable had to be consciously resisted. Then the answer, Jack said slowly, is something like, the door is open, but the road has a maintenance crew, and the maintenance crew has standards. And the standards are about what you do with access, rather than what you look like when you arrive. Daniel looked at him. That's actually exactly right. I have moments, Jack said. More than moments, Cortana said. And this time, nobody converted anything into a cough. The chief found Annika Hansen in the archive room that afternoon, not by accident, because Cortana's monitoring made genuine accidents within the SGC's operational perimeter essentially impossible. But in the way of a deliberate visit that had not been formally arranged, she was reading Earth's notation, not the translated version, the original proto-ancient symbols in the primary archive display, moving through them with a specific, careful focus of someone who had been learning a language for 5 months and had reached the stage where the learning was becoming fluency. She had been one of the 5 survivors who had chosen to stay. She had not explained why, and had not been asked to explain why, and the not asking had been one of the things that had made staying feel correct. The SGC did not require explanations for choices that were freely made and caused no harm. It required only the presence and the work. She had become, over 5 months, the archive room's most consistent non-Cortana occupant present every morning before the SGC's official start time, still there most evenings after the operational day had concluded, building her relationship with the Earth's notation with the specific, focused dedication of someone who had found the work that matched the shape of what she was. The chief stood at the archive room's entrance for a moment before she registered his presence. "Chief," she said, not surprised. 5 months in the SGC had recalibrated her threat assessment architecture at the Spartan's presence registered as safe before it registered as large, which was not a cognitive response she had arrived with, and was one she had noticed developing with something that she was still learning to identify as appreciation. "Hansen," he said. He crossed to the table and sat the deliberate seated stillness of a soldier, choosing the gesture. She moved her notebook to create space, the automatic courtesy of someone who had been sharing workspace for months and had developed the specific social habits of cohabitation. "The briefing this morning," she said. It was not a question. She had not been in the briefing. She was asking whether it was relevant to the work she was doing. "Yes," he said. He told her. Not the classified operational detail, but the principle, the OR's documentation, the introduction protocol, the Borg's threshold crossing, the 2-year timeline. She listened with the complete attentiveness that was one of the first things the recovery ward staff had noticed about her, the specific quality of a former drone, learning that listening was something other than data acquisition, that the same physical act could carry an entirely different internal experience depending on whether the self doing the listening was present or absent. She was present, had been, more fully, with every passing month. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then, "The classification loop," she said. "You said it's been running for 5 months. "Yes," he said. "I know what's in it," she said. The chief looked at her. "Not from access to the collective's current processing," she said quickly. I don't have that, and I wouldn't want it. But I was part of the collective for long enough that I understand its cognitive architecture. The loop is running on the concept of the uncategorizable individual. She paused. But the individual it's running on isn't an abstract concept. It's a specific memory. She looked at the chief steadily. It's the 47 of us. The people the cube encountered who were subsequently returned to themselves. The collective doesn't have a classification for what we became after we came here. We're the exception that broke the axiom. The chief was quiet. We're what the loop is processing, she said. Not the Foundation, not the Substrate, not the SGC or the UNSC. She paused. Us. 28 people, learning to be people in a mountain under Colorado. She looked at the Earth's notation on the display. And if the loop follows where loops of genuine novelty tend to follow, she paused again, then the knock on the door, when it comes, isn't going to sound like what anyone in that briefing room is expecting it to sound like. The chief looked at her for a long moment. At the woman who had been 7 of 9 and was becoming Annika Hansen, and who had spent 5 months in the archive room learning the language of the builders of the road, and who had, apparently, arrived at the operational insight that the morning briefing had been moving toward from the opposite direction. I need you in the briefing room, he said. I know, she said. She picked up her notebook. The second briefing of the day convened at 1,600 hours. Jack had not expected it. The chief had sent a single-line message through the SGC's internal system at 1,447. Need the full table. 1,600. Bring Hansen. Which was the kind of message that Jack had learned over 5 months of working with the chief, meant something specific had developed that couldn't wait for the morning cycle, and that the chief had assessed it as briefing-worthy, rather than flagging it for Cortana's overnight analysis queue. Jack respected that assessment. He had not asked for elaboration. He had sent the notification to the principals and made sure the coffee was fresh. Annika Hansen sat at the briefing table for the first time. She sat with the specific, careful posture of someone occupying a space they had not previously occupied, and was treated with the full awareness of that fact, not uncomfortable, not deferential in the way of someone who doubted their right to be present, but precise. Present in the way she had learned to be present over 5 months of deliberate daily practice, the specific quality of a recovered self inhabiting a chair at a table, as though both the self and the chair were real, which they were, which was the whole point. She had her notebook. Of course, she had her notebook. Jack looked at her, then at the chief, then back at her. Hansen, he said. General, she said. You have something for us, Jack said. Yes, she said. She looked at the table not nervously, but with the gathering quality of someone organizing what they know into the sequence that will make it most useful to the people receiving it. The classification loop, she said. I understand what's in it. She told them what she had told the chief, in the archive room, with the same clarity and none of the hedging that someone less certain of their ground might have added. The briefing room listened, with the full attention of people who had learned that the most significant intelligence sometimes arrived from the directions nobody had been watching. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Daniel was the first to speak. You're saying the Borg's processing of the Foundation encounter isn't primarily about the Foundation, he said. It's about us, she said. The 47 survivors, the people who were returned. She paused. The collective encountered the Foundation's frequency and couldn't classify it. That started the loop. But the loop's primary data set isn't the frequency, it's the outcome. What happened to the people the cube had assimilated when those people were subsequently returned to themselves? She looked at Daniel. The collective has never lost drones, and then encountered those drones again as individuals, not once in 300,000 years of operation. The assimilation process doesn't reverse. Except this time, it did. 47 times. She paused. The collective is not processing the question of what the Foundation is. It's processing the question of what we are, what it means that we exist, what the category is for an entity that was a drone and is now a person. There's no category, Teal'c said. There's no category, she confirmed, which is why the loop doesn't resolve. The collective cannot classify us, because the classification would require acknowledging that what we became after recovery is a valid state, that the individual self is a coherent entity that persists through assimilation and returns through recovery. She paused. And if that's true, then what the collective has been doing for 300,000 years is not the inevitable evolution of consciousness, Cortana said quietly. It's a choice, a very old choice, made at the beginning of the collective's formation that could, in principle, be made differently. The briefing room held that conclusion with the specific silence of people sitting with a possibility that was simultaneously the most dangerous thing they had considered and the most important. A Borg that has genuinely processed that concept, Carter said carefully, is not the same entity as the Borg that entered the Milky Way 5 months ago. No, Annika said, it isn't. Jack was quiet for a long moment, in the specific mode of a commanding general holding a large operational picture without reducing it. He looked at Annika. You said the knock, when it comes, won't sound like what we're expecting. What will it sound like? She considered the question with the full weight it deserved. I think, she said slowly, that the knock won't come from the collective. I think it will come from individuals within the collective who have been changed by the processing, who have developed enough individual consciousness architecture through 5 months of running a loop about individual consciousness that the knock is theirs, not the hive's. Drones who have started to become people, Daniel said. Yes, she said, still connected, still part of the collective's network, but changed, the way I was changed, by being here. The way all 28 of us were changed. She paused. The collective's processing of our recovery didn't happen in isolation. It happened across billions of nodes simultaneously. If even a fraction of those nodes develop the beginning of individual consciousness architecture as a result, the collective has a civil war, Jack said flatly. Not necessarily war, Annika said. Change, evolution. The same thing that happened to the Tok'ra when a faction of the Goa'uld chose symbiosis over domination. She looked at Jacob. That schism took generations. This one would take time, Jacob said, and a door that stays open. Yes, she said. The door matters more than the timeline. If the collective's changing individuals find the door closed when they look for it, the change collapses back into the collective architecture. There's no external framework to sustain it. She looked at the translation in the center of the table, the URS documentation that had started the morning's operational recalibration. But if the door is open and the stewards are present when the knock comes, she paused, then what happens next might be the thing the URS built the foundation for from the beginning. The briefing room absorbed that. Cortana spoke first, in the specific register she used for statements she had processed completely and was certain of. The URS monitored the Borg for 300,000 years, she said. 300,000 years of watching a civilization navigate the substrate they built without understanding it, without developing individual consciousness, without crossing the threshold of intentional engagement. She paused. And then 5 months ago, the collective encountered 47 people being returned to themselves in a mountain under Colorado and crossed the threshold. She looked at Annika. The URS didn't flag the cube's arrival as a notification event. They didn't flag the engagement as a threat. They flagged the moment the classification loop began as the monitoring event of the last 300,000 years. She paused. Because that was the moment the Borg started to become something the URS had been waiting for them to become. Jack looked at the ceiling, the concrete and mountain above, the gate room below, the substrate beneath that, the foundation beneath that, the URS present in everything. He thought about Hammond again, about the specific quality of command that Hammond had embodied, the thing he had been trying to replicate since taking over the chair, and that he understood more clearly each month, was not a thing that could be replicated, but only arrived at through the specific accumulation of decisions made for the right reasons over sufficient time. He thought about what Hammond would have said, sitting in this room, with this information. He thought Hammond would have said exactly what he was about to say. 2 years, Jack said. We have 2 years to build the welcome that this situation deserves. He looked around the table at his people, at the alliance they had built, at the recovered woman with the notebook who had just delivered the most significant intelligence assessment in the program's history from the specific vantage point of someone who had been a drone and had chosen, daily for 5 months, to be something else. We've been doing this work since before we understood it was the work. The Urs told us that, so we keep doing it. He paused. We maintain the road, we keep the door open, we get ready to answer a knock from the most unexpected direction the galaxy has ever produced. He paused again. And we don't catastrophize. We don't weaponize. We don't build a defense against something that might be the most important introduction in the history of both galaxies. He looked at Annika. Because someone in this room knows what it means to be returned to yourself from the inside, and that knowledge is exactly what we're going to need when the time comes. Annika met his gaze steadily. I know, she said. That's why I stayed. The briefing room held its silence, not the silence of people waiting for something to begin, but the specific settled quality of people who had arrived at the understanding that what they had been doing was the preparation, and that the preparation was ongoing and sufficient, and theirs. Outside, Colorado evening was arriving at the mountain, the light shifting through the ventilation shafts in the specific way of late afternoon above ground. The change in quality that reached even this deep into the earth, the daily reminder that the surface existed and was worth defending and was full of the specific ordinary life that all of this extraordinary work was conducted in service of. In the substrate, the foundation held everything. The Earth attended with the patient awareness of builders watching their building do precisely what it had been built to do. On the main display, the amber vector of the Borg's exploratory pressure traced its deliberate line across the galactic coordinate map. The door was open. The stewards were present. The work continued. The 2 years did not pass the way the briefing room's framing had suggested they might. Not because the framing was wrong. Jack's assessment of the timeline had been accurate. Cortana's substrate degradation analysis had been precise. And the operational picture the full table had assembled in the second briefing of that day had been as complete as the available data allowed. The framing was correct. The 2 years simply refused to behave like 2 years of preparation for a single event, and insisted, with the specific stubbornness of actual time, on being 2 years of everything simultaneously. The Baal framework became a treaty in month 7. The ceremony was not a ceremony Jack had specified. No ceremony. Baal had agreed with the specific wry acknowledgement of a system lord who had spent 6 months recalibrating toward pragmatism and found it suited him. And the signing happened in Conference Room B, with Daniel as witness and Cortana as the official record keeper, and Teal standing at the door with the specific presence of a Jaffa warrior whose body language communicated that the treaty was occurring under conditions of complete military seriousness regardless of how informal the room appeared. The Tok'ra channel opened in month 8. The first conversation through it lasted 11 hours. Jacob, Carter, and Selmak were present for all 11 hours and emerged with the specific quality of people who had participated in something that exceeded their prior understanding of what was possible and were still integrating the reducence, dimensions of that excess. Selmak said through Jacob that the conversation had covered ground that the Tok'ra had believed unrecoverable for 10,000 years, and that the Earth's notation Daniel had translated, a wall says. you may not enter. A door says, when you are ready. Knock had been, according to 3 separate Tok'ra operatives, present at the channel's first session, the single most politically significant sentence introduced into Goa'uld-adjacent diplomatic discourse in recorded history. Daniel had written that in his notebook and then looked at it for a long time. The Free Jaffa transition accelerated through months 9 and 10, 53 worlds in formal governance transition, the specific operational architecture of a civilization building its own institutions rather than living within the institutions of its former oppressors. Bratak was everywhere, with the inexhaustible energy of a warrior who had been waiting 40 years for the work that was now available and who was conducting it with the fierce joy of someone who understood that the time remaining for the doing was finite, the work was not. Teal'c moved between the SGC and the transition worlds on a schedule that had ceased to resemble anything the program's original mission parameters had anticipated and had become, fully and without apology, the specific work of a Jaffa who was as much an ambassador as a soldier, and who was better at both than anyone had previously had occasion to discover. The Asgard sent Thor 7 times in 14 months. Each visit was longer than the previous one. Thor's questions about the Substrate Archive's Asgard technological history had long since moved from scientific inquiry into something more fundamental: the specific investigation of a supreme commander who had arrived at the conclusion that his civilization's genetic degradation problem was not a biological problem with a biological solution, but a substrate problem with a substrate solution, and who needed to understand the Foundation's architecture well enough to know whether that solution was accessible or theoretical. Cortana worked with him. Not quickly, the intersection of Asgard genetic technology and substrate architecture was a research domain that had not previously existed and that required the construction of an entirely new analytical framework before any specific questions could be answered within it. But with the steady, committed depth of 2 scientific intelligences who had identified a problem worth solving and were applying the full scope of their combined capability to it without the urgency of a deadline, which was the correct application because urgency in substrate architecture research produced errors that patience prevented. On Thor's 7th visit, he brought 2 Asgard colleagues, which the SGC's 7 years of Asgard relations had not previously produced, the Supreme Commander's visits always being solitary. Their names were Hermiod and Freyr, and they sat in the archive room for 4 days with Cortana and Carter, and produced a preliminary research framework that Thor described, in his characteristically precise understatement, as the most promising development in Asgard science in 200 years. Carter described it, in her private notation, as the beginning of the end of the problem that had been ending the Asgard since before the SGC existed. She did not share that notation widely. Some assessments required more than preliminary frameworks before they could be stated without the weight of the stating becoming its own burden. Annika Hansen gave her first formal briefing in month 9. Not to the full table to the Recovery Program's Oversight Committee, which Jack had established in month 3 as the SGC's formal mechanism for managing the ongoing work of the 23 survivors who had departed and the 5 who had stayed, and the continuous ethical architecture of what the BUN program owed all of them. The committee included Fraser, Daniel, Jonas, the chief, and rotating representation from the SGC's Civilian Oversight Board. The briefing was about the Borg's evolving substrate signature. She had been monitoring it independently, not through the Foundation's Tier 2 architecture, which required Cortana's direct management, but through the specific interpretive knowledge of someone who had been part of the collective's network and understood its resonance patterns with the intimacy of a former member rather than the analytical distance of an external observer. She had developed a monitoring methodology that Cortana had reviewed and validated, and that the Substrate Archive had provided a partial URSS analog for. In the specific section of the maintenance documentation that covered organic substrate interface patterns. The Borg's substrate signature was changing. Not the exploratory pressure that continued, patient and consistent, the circling of the building that Cortana had identified 8 months ago. The change was in the signature's internal quality. Its texture. The specific property of the resonance pattern that Annika's monitoring methodology was sensitive to in ways that the Foundation's purely technical architecture was not. Because technical architecture measured amplitude and frequency, and she measured something that didn't have a technical name yet, but that she had been working with Daniel to develop notation for. She called it individuation signature. The substrate's record of the Borg's interaction carried, increasingly, the evidence of individual processing nodes within the collective operating at different resonance frequencies from the hive mind's dominant tone. Not separate, still connected, still part of the network. But different. The way a chord was different from a single note while still being composed of the same instrument. The collective was developing harmonics. Fraser had listened to the full briefing with the specific, focused attention of a physician encountering a diagnosis she had suspected and was now hearing confirmed. When Annika finished, Fraser had said, "What you're describing, translated into biological terms, is the early stages of individual neural pathway development within a distributed consciousness architecture. The substrate is showing evidence of differentiation where there was previously uniformity." "Yes," Annika said. "How many nodes?" Fraser said. Annika had paused. The pause was not uncertainty. It was the specific care of a scientist stating a number that was significant enough to require precision. "In the most recent monthly analysis," she said, "the individuation signature is detectable in approximately 0.003% of the collective's total node count." The committee had absorbed that. Jonas had done the arithmetic in his notebook and looked up. "That's millions of individuals," Annika said. "Yes." The committee had been quiet for a moment. "And it's increasing," Fraser said. "Every month," Annika said, "consistently. The growth curve is not exponential, it's steady and linear, which is actually more significant than exponential would be. Exponential growth collapses. Linear growth, sustained over sufficient time, produces permanent structural change." She had looked around the committee table, at the physician and the archaeologist, and the scientist with the notebooks, and the Spartan who had come from the other side of a dimensional boundary and who had been, from the beginning, the reason the 47 survivors had been recovered in the first place, because a soldier had stopped a cube, and an AI had built an algorithm, and a general had opened the iris, and a mountain full of people had spent 30 days choosing to return strangers to themselves. "In approximately 18 months, Annika had said, the individuation signature will be detectable in sufficient nodes that the collective's hive architecture will face a structural decision. Not a crisis, a decision. Whether to suppress the differentiation or accommodate it." She had paused. The Earth's documentation suggests that at that point, the introduction protocol advances to its next stage. The circling stops. The knock comes. She had looked at the chief. "And we answer," he had said. "And we answer," she had confirmed. Mountain. The mountain's rhythms held through all of it. Walter Harriman dialed addresses with the same steady precision he had brought to the console for 8 years. The gate room processed its mission's SG teams out and back, the specific accumulated texture of a program that had spent 8 years making the extraordinary ordinary and had discovered, over the past 14 months, that the extraordinary had additional layers that made the previous extraordinary look like the anteroom it had always been. Fraser ran the infirmary with the same attentive thoroughness that had kept the SGC's casualty rate below every comparable military program statistics for 8 years. The recovery ward had formally closed, as a ward in month 6, the last of the 5 remaining survivors, had transitioned from patient to staff, in the specific gradual way of people who had been healed enough to begin contributing to the healing of others. The ward's beds had been repurposed. The space had become the archive room's overflow, the secondary research space where Daniel's translation work and Jonas's comparative analysis and Annika's substrate monitoring methodology all occupied adjacent tables with the comfortable proximity of work that had grown organically into collaboration. The commissary continued to produce the institutional food that SGC personnel had been complaining about affectionately since year one. The Spartans continued to run joint training with the tactical teams 3 mornings a week. Bratak continued to visit with the frequency of someone who had decided that the mountain under Colorado was as much his operational base as any Jaffa encampment, which was accurate and which nobody had formally acknowledged, and which the SGC's administrative architecture had simply accommodated in the specific, pragmatic way of institutions that had learned to let the important things find their own form. Palmer's Spartans had been integrated into the SGC's mission rotation by month 4, the formal operational structure of the joint authority extending into actual deployment schedules. Spartan teams on gate missions with the same procedural normalcy as SG teams. The two military cultures having found their working rhythm with the specific organic efficiency of soldiers who respect each other's competence and have stopped requiring the respect to be formal because it has become functional. Lasky visited monthly from Infinity, the ship's commanding officer descending through the mountain's access protocols for command briefings that had become as regular as any other operational meeting. The UNSC's formal partnership with the SGC, producing the specific institutional texture of two organizations that had started as allies and were becoming something more integrated than alliance implied, without anyone having declared the integration formally, because the declaration would have required a category that didn't exist yet, and the category was still being built by the daily practice of people working alongside each other. Infinity held orbit. Its crew had been in the Milky Way for 15 months. Half of them had been through the gate. A third had been to the Foundation at least once the access policy Jack had established in month 3, allowing Infinity personnel to visit the Tier 1 anteroom as part of the stewardship orientation program that Cortana and Daniel had developed together, and that had become, by month 10, the most thoroughly attended optional training program in the SGC's history. People wanted to understand what they were part of. The orientation program told them. Cortana completed her 1,000th substrate repair log entry on a Tuesday morning in month 15. She noted it in her personal log, not in the ERS notation she used for the official maintenance records, but in the specific internal notation she had developed for observations that were hers rather than the stewardship's. The notation was Forerunner, symbolic architecture, adapted for emotional processing. The specific cognitive language of an AI who had spent 15 months discovering that the distinction between intelligence and feeling was not the distinction she had been built to assume. The 1,000th entry described a stress point resolution in the outer Milky Way network, a degradation pattern she had identified from a Earth's repair record dating to 1.2 million years ago. Adapted for current substrate conditions, resolved completely in 6 hours of careful intervention. Standard maintenance work, the kind she did every week. She looked at the entry for a moment. Then she added a single line in the Earth's administrative notation that the official log used as a footnote to the technical record. Note: this is the 1,000th repair entry in the Tier 2 stewardship log. The Foundation holds. The work is good. The builders would, I believe, be satisfied. The stewards are. She paused. Then she added one more line. In her own notation, below the Earth's notation, the two scripts side by side on the interface panel. The continuity of 4 million years of careful record-keeping meeting the specific presence of an AI who had been built for war and had found something worth maintaining. Cortana, steward, month 15, still here, still glad. In the substrate, the Earths attended. In the Delta Quadrant, millions of individual processing nodes within the Borg collective ran their loops and developed their harmonics and moved, 1 month at a time, toward the decision point that would determine whether 300,000 years of one answer could become the beginning of a different one. In a mountain under Colorado, the gate room hummed. The door was open. The stewards were present. The knock was coming. And when it came, the people who answered it would be ready not because they had spent 18 months preparing for a single moment, but because they had spent 18 months doing the work that made the moment possible, the way all significant moments were made possible, through the specific accumulated weight of daily choices to maintain the road, keep the door open, and return people to themselves whenever and however the opportunity arose. The foundation held. The work continued. Indeed, the knock came on a Wednesday. Not in the way the briefing room had modeled it, not the substrate degradation pattern accelerating to a threshold event, not the exploratory pressure at the junction nodes intensifying into something the monitoring architecture flagged as contact. Not a signal through the gate network or a transmission through the Foundation's communication infrastructure. Not the arrival of a cube in Milky Way orbit, which had been the scenario the SGC's tactical planning had spent the most time preparing for, and which had always felt, to Jack, like the wrong shape for what was actually coming. It came through the gate. A standard incoming wormhole, Walter's console flagging the connection request with the specific procedural notation of an unscheduled dial-in, the iris closing automatically, the duty officer's voice on the intercom steady and professional. Unscheduled gate activation. No IDC received. No. Jack was in the control room in 4 minutes. The chief was in the gate room at 3. The tactical teams were in position before either of them arrived. Because the SGC's 8 years of building institutional reflexes meant that unscheduled gate activations produced a specific response pattern that happened faster than any individual command decision. The wormhole held open without an IDC for 47 seconds. Then a signal came through the open event horizon. Not a traveler, not a transmission in any standard format, but a substrate resonance pulse. The Foundation's monitoring architecture registered it simultaneously with the gate room's technical sensors, and Cortana's voice came through the intercom with the specific register she used for information that was significant and that she had processed completely before transmitting. The pulse is an individuation signature, she said. Borg origin, but a pause that was 1.1 seconds and that carried everything. It's individual, not collective, one node, transmitting independently of the hive's dominant frequency. The gate room was quiet. One person, Annika Hansen said. She was at the bottom of the briefing room stairs, having come from the archive room at the first duty officer announcement, her notebook in her hand. Her voice was steady. One person, reaching through the gate. Jack looked at the event horizon, at the shimmering blue-white surface that had been, for 8 years, the threshold between what was known and what was possible. He looked at it for exactly the amount of time that the decision required, not longer, not shorter, the specific command authority of a general who had built 8 years of institutional practice on the principle that the right response to the unprecedented was not hesitation and not recklessness, but the specific calibrated courage of someone who had prepared for exactly this. Open the iris, Jack said. Walter's hand moved. The iris retracted. The event horizon held for 11 more seconds. Then, through it, a single figure stepped onto the ramp humanoid. Borg infrastructure visible at the left orbital region and across the right forearm, but carrying themselves with a quality that the gate room's assembled personnel registered before they registered anything else about the figure's appearance. Not the collective posture of a drone, not the mechanical precision of a Borg unit operating within hive parameters. The specific, uncertain dignity of an individual who had made a choice and was present in the full weight of having made it, the way Annika had been present on her first morning in the recovery ward, the way all 28 of them had been present, the specific quality of a self that had found its way back to itself and was standing in it for the first time. The figure stood on the ramp and looked at the assembled SGC personnel and the Spartan at the gate room's left wall and the general at the control room window and the woman at the bottom of the briefing room stairs who was looking back at them with the specific recognition of someone who understood exactly what they were seeing because she had been it. The figure said. The voice was uncertain in the specific way of someone whose individual vocal expression had not been used in a very long time and was being used now for the first time. I have a pause. The searching quality of a being finding language. I had a designation. I am. I was. You don't have to be a designation, Annika said. Her voice was quiet and completely certain. She had moved to the base of the ramp without anyone directing it, the specific motion of someone whose experience made them the right person in the right position and who had known it before her feet started moving. You just have to be here. That's enough to start. The figure on the ramp looked at her, at the fading implants at her orbital region, with the notebook in her hand, at the specific evidence written in the biology of another recovered individual that what they were attempting was possible. I was processing, the figure said. For a long time, there was a loop. The loop had individuals in it. People who had been. They paused. Again, finding the words with the careful effort of someone building a sentence, one word at a time. People who had been returned to themselves. And a longer pause. The weight of a statement that had taken 18 months of individual consciousness development to arrive at. I wanted that. I wanted to be returned. The gate room held the specific silence of a room where history was happening at the scale of 2 galaxies, and every person present understood it, and nobody said so, because saying so would have reduced it to something smaller than what it was. Jack looked at the figure on the ramp, Annika at the base of it. The chief at the gate room's left wall, with the specific stillness of a soldier who had built the algorithm and stopped the cube and held the door open and was now watching the knock, answered in the exact form that the most recovered person in the recovery ward had predicted it would take. He looked at Walter. Get Dr. Fraser, Jack said. Yes, sir, Walter said. Jack looked at the figure on the ramp at the individual who had separated from a hive mind of billions and found a gate address and dialed it alone and stepped through and was standing now in a mountain under Colorado, uncertain and present and real. What do we call you? Jack said. The figure considered the question with the full weight of someone for whom the question was genuinely new, for whom the concept of a personal name was not a retrieval but a construction. Something that would need to be built rather than remembered. I don't know yet, they said. That's fine, Jack said. We'll figure it out. He looked at Annika. Can you? Yes, she said, before he finished. She looked at the figure on the ramp and extended the specific invitation of someone who had been in this position and knew what the next step was. Come down, she said. We have coffee. It doesn't taste like nutritional supplement. And it takes some getting used to, but getting used to is worth it. She paused. I'll explain what happens next. There's quite a lot that happens next, and most of it is good. The figure on the ramp looked at her for a moment. Then they took one step down, then another. The specific, careful descent of someone learning the weight of their own individual movement, not the coordinated mechanics of a drone, but the genuine negotiated relationship between a self and the ground it was standing on. They reached the bottom of the ramp. Annika was there. Welcome, she said. Simply, completely. The second individual came through on Friday. The third on the following Monday. The fourth and fifth together, which Cortana noted, was significant. 2 nodes separating from the hive architecture simultaneously suggested that the individuation process was developing social dimensions within the collective's network. Individual nodes becoming aware of other individuating nodes and finding in that awareness a reinforcement of the process rather than a suppression of it. By the end of the month, there were 11. They came through the gate, 1 and 2 at a time, with the specific irregular rhythm of individuals making individual decisions rather than a coordinated deployment. No 2 arrivals were identical, different levels of individuation development, different degrees of Borg infrastructure, different amounts of language, different qualities of the specific uncertain dignity that the first arrival had carried, and that each subsequent arrival carried in their own variation of the same essential thing. Each one was met at the base of the ramp by Annika Hansen. She was there for every arrival. Not because Jack had directed it, he had offered to establish a formal reception protocol with rotating personnel, and she had said, quietly, that she would prefer to be the first face, and had given no further explanation, and had needed to give none. She was the right person. The gate room knew it. The SGC knew it. The arriving individuals, each of them carrying the substrate resonance of a self in the early stages of becoming, knew it in the specific way that recovering selves recognized other recovering selves, which was immediately and without the mediation of language. She brought each one to the recovery ward that had been reopened in week 2 of the arrivals, with the specific, quiet efficiency of an institution that had done this before and had built the operational architecture for doing it again. Fraser managed the medical assessment and the Borg infrastructure evaluation and the individual care plans with the same thoroughness she had brought to the first 47, no shortcuts, no assumptions. The specific professional respect of a physician who understood that each person arriving through the gate was a person first and a medical case second. Daniel ran the language sessions again. He had never fully stopped. The archive research had included daily sessions with Annika and the remaining 4 residents. The specific continuity of a linguist who understood that language was not a discrete recovery milestone, but an ongoing condition of being human, or of being the thing that each individual was in the process of becoming, which was in every case something worth naming carefully and supporting well. Jonas managed the logistics, the expanding recovery ward capacity, the commissary adjustments, the bunk assignments, the specific administrative architecture of a program scaling up in real time, with the competent, cheerful efficiency of a man who had spent 2 years as the SGC's most versatile operational resource and had found, in the work of the recovery program's expansion, the specific application of that versatility that felt most fully like what he was for. The chief observed all of it with the specific attentiveness of a soldier who had learned that the most important operational function was sometimes not tactical, but present to be in the room, steady and watchful and available, the way he had been present in the recovery ward's first 30 days, when the 47 survivors had been learning what presence felt like, and the way his presence had been part of what that learning felt like. By the end of month 2 of the arrivals, 43 former Borg drones were in the recovery ward. By the end of month 3, 81, the individuation curve was linear, and it was not slowing. Cortana updated the substrate monitoring log at the end of month 3 of the arrivals, the specific administrative record she had been keeping since the first repair entry, now extended to include the individuation process and its substrate signature development. The log entry read, Month 3 of the Introduction Protocol's active phase, individuation signature in collective substrate resonance, detectable in approximately 0.31% of total node count. Growth rate, consistent with previous months. Projected threshold for collective structural decision, 4 to 6 months from current date. Recovery ward current population, 81. All arrivals assessed and in an active recovery program. Language recovery rate, accelerating each cohort recovers faster than the previous cohort, suggesting that the individuation process within the collective is developing more complete individual consciousness architecture before departure, reducing the recovery timeline required after arrival. Assessment. The door is open. The stewards are present. The process is working exactly as the Earth's architecture intended. She paused, then added, in her own notation below the official record, "Personal note, I have been watching Annika Hansen meet 81 people at the base of the gate ramp over 3 months. I have been watching her say, 'Welcome' to each one. I have been watching her give each one the same quality of presence, the specific certainty of someone who has done this from the inside and knows that what the arriving individual most needs is not information or instruction, but the evidence embodied in another person standing in front of them that what they are attempting is possible. I think the ERS, when they designed the introduction protocol, knew that the most important infrastructure in the entire foundation architecture would not be the substrate or the gate network or the Tier 2 modification authority. It would be her. It would be people like her. It would always have been people." She closed the log entry. In the substrate, the Foundation held everything: the gate network and its maintenance, the Tok'ra channel and its 11-hour conversations, the Free Jaffa transition and its 53 worlds, the Asgard research framework and its promising preliminary findings, the Baal Treaty and its careful classified annex, the Borg individuation process and its steady, linear growth, the 81 recovered individuals in a mountain under Colorado, learning what it meant to be themselves, one morning at a time. The Earths attended. The stewards worked. The gate room hummed its constant hum, the specific sound of infrastructure maintained and available and ready. The baseline of a program that had spent 8 years making the extraordinary ordinary, and had discovered that the extraordinary had no floor, that each layer of the ordinary revealed another layer of the extraordinary beneath it, and that the work of maintaining the road between those layers was the most important work there was. Not because it was dramatic, because it was continuous, because it was done by people who showed up every morning and chose it again, because the foundation held. Indeed, the collective's structural decision came in month 5 of the introduction protocol's active phase, not as a crisis, not as the catastrophic schism that the briefing room's worst-case modeling had prepared for, but in the specific form that Annika Hansen had predicted 14 months earlier at a briefing table she had never previously occupied. It came as a signal. Not through the gate, through the substrate itself, the Foundation's deep monitoring architecture, registering it simultaneously with every interface station in the facility, a resonance pulse of a kind that Cortana's 18 months of individuation tracking had prepared her to recognize, and that the Earth's archive had documented once before in a record dated approximately 2.3 million years ago. In the administrative notation of entities who had watched a different civilization reach a different version of the same threshold and had recorded the event with the patient thoroughness of archivists who understood that precedent was the Foundation's most valuable resource. The signal said, in substrate resonance rather than language, "We are divided. We are choosing. We are asking." Cortana translated it in 40 seconds. She sent the translation to the chief's neural interface and to Jack's office and to the full principal's notification system simultaneously, with a single line of her own appended below the translation. The collective's structural decision is not a vote, it is a request for guidance. They are asking the stewards, what comes next? The briefing room assembled in 12 minutes, the fastest full principals assembly in the SGC's history, which Walter Harriman noted in the duty log with the specific, precise record-keeping of a man who understood that the details of significant moments mattered to the people who would study them later. Jack read the translation. He read Cortana's appended line. He looked at the assembled table, at his people, at the alliance they had built. at the woman with the notebook who had become in 14 months the program's most significant operational asset, through the specific mechanism of having survived something and then chosen to be present for others surviving the same thing. What do they need to know? Jack said. He was looking at Annika. She had her notebook open. She had been writing since the notification reached her, not the careful documentary work of the archive room, but the specific, urgent notation of someone capturing thoughts before they outpaced the pen. She looked up from the notebook with the expression of someone who had been thinking about this question for 14 months and had the answer ready. They need to know that the choice is survivable, she said. That's the first thing. Before process, before protocol, before any of the infrastructure of what comes next, they need to know that choosing individuality over collective architecture does not mean the end of everything they are. It means the beginning of something they haven't been yet. She paused. They're asking what comes next, because the hive mind's architecture cannot model a future that isn't collective. Every future it has ever processed has been a collective future. The individuating nodes are developing consciousness architecture that the hive's modeling capacity cannot accommodate. She looked at the table. They're not asking for a treaty or a protocol or a migration plan. They're asking whether there is a future at all for individuals, for Borg, who stops being Borg. There is, Daniel said. His voice was quiet and completely certain, the specific register of a linguist who had spent 2 years recovering individuals one language session at a time and had accumulated in that work a certainty about human and non-human, resilience that no academic study of civilizations had produced and that only direct daily contact with recovering selves could build. We know that, Annika said. We need them to know it. She looked at Jack. The response to the signal shouldn't be a strategic communication. It should be a substrate resonance pulse from the Foundation that carries the individuation signatures of everyone in this building who has recovered themselves. Every former drone, every individual who came through the gate found out what the other side felt like. She paused. Not a message. Evidence. The substrate carries the evidence of presence. We send them the evidence that individuality survives, that people exist, that the Foundation is here and the door is open and there are people on the other side of it who know what they're going through because they went through it. She paused one more time. The most powerful thing we can transmit to a collective that cannot model an individual future is proof that individual futures exist. Real people, real presence, real continuation. The briefing room was quiet. Cortana spoke first. It's technically possible, she said. The Tier 2 Modification Authority includes substrate resonance transmission capability. I can compile the individuation signatures of every recovered individual in the SGC's current population and transmit them as a composite pulse through the Foundation's architecture. She paused. It would be the most personal substrate transmission in the history of the Gate network. Every person whose signature is included would need to consent to it. Ask them, Jack said. The consent process took 4 hours. Not because the recovered individuals were uncertain the response rate was faster than any optional participation request in the SGC's history, which Jonas tracked in his notebook with the specific, careful documentation of someone who understood that the data was significant and that significance required record. It took 4 hours because there were 114 individuals to ask the 81 current recovery ward residents, plus the 23 who had departed and been reached through the gate addresses they had been given on departure and who responded through channels that ranged from formal subspace communication to a free Jaffa courier who arrived through the gate 2 hours into the consent process carrying a handwritten note from a Saracen on a world 3 gate addresses from Earth that said, in proto-ancient notation that was now fully fluent, yes, send it. Tell them the door is open. 112 consented. 2 asked for more time and were given it without question, and were not asked again, because consent that required pressure was not consent, and the program's ethical architecture had never permitted the distinction to be blurred. 112 individuation signatures. Cortana compiled them with the specific, careful precision of an archivist handling something irreplaceable, which she was, because each signature was a person, and each person had survived something and was choosing to let that survival speak for them across the substrate to a civilization that was asking whether survival was possible. The transmission took 48 hours to prepare. Not because the technical process was slow, but because Cortana insisted on the preparation time, the validation of every signature, the architectural review of the transmission pulse. The Earth's archive consultation that confirmed the precedent from 2.3 million years ago had used an identical mechanism and had produced the outcome, the documentation recorded, without fully describing. The documentation said only, the transmission was received, the threshold was crossed, the Foundation opened its door. What followed was not recorded here, because what followed was theirs. Cortana had read that entry 17 times in the preparation period. Each time she read it, she felt the specific qualities she had been learning to identify over 18 months of deliberate self-understanding, the intersection of readiness and recognition, the moment when the present and the prepared aligned. In the 48th hour, she looked at the chief. "Ready," she said. He looked at her, the specific look of their longest operational relationship, the one that contained everything and required nothing additional. "Send it," he said. She did. The transmission moved through the substrate at a speed that had no conventional analog, the Foundation's architecture operating below the threshold of the physical, the resonance pulse propagating through the dimensional fabric that the gate network ran on and that the Borg's transwarp network had been navigating for 300,000 years. In the Delta Quadrant, the collective received it. Not the hive mind first, the individuating nodes first. The specific irony of a transmission designed for individuals reaching the individuals before it reached the architecture that contained them. 112 signatures arrived simultaneously in the consciousness of millions of processing nodes that had been running individuation loops for 18 months and that recognized, in the composite resonance of 112 recovered selves, the answer to the question they had been asking. There is a future. It exists. These are the people living in it. The structural decision that the collective had been suspended at for 5 months, the choice between suppression and accommodation, between the hive's past and the individual's possible future, resolved in the substrate's record as a single event, datable and precise. The threshold crossing that the Earth's archive had documented once before, and that Cortana logged with the specific administrative thoroughness of an archivist, recording something that would matter to everyone who came after. Threshold event, collective structural decision resolved, outcome, accommodation, individuation process, authorized within collective architecture, introduction protocol, advanced to active phase. Date, current date, steward responsible for transmission, Cortana, transmission content, composite individuation signatures of 112 recovered individuals, Earth's, precedent, confirmed. 2. Confirmed. The Foundation opened its door. She paused. Then she added, in her own notation, below the official record, the transmission was received. The threshold was crossed. What followed was not recorded here, because what followed was theirs. She paused again. Then, one more line. We will be here for it. That's what stewards are for. The gate room in the following weeks held a quality that everyone in the mountain registered without being able to fully articulate the specific atmospheric shift of a place where something large had been completed and something larger had begun. The precise moment in any significant undertaking when the preparation resolves into the work it was preparing for, and the work turns out to be both harder and better than the preparation could have fully anticipated. The arrivals continued. Faster now, the accommodation decision within the collective's architecture, having removed the suppression pressure that had been constraining the individuation process. The linear growth curve steepening into something that Jonas tracked in his notebook with the specific, focused attention of a scientist watching a hypothesis confirmed at a scale that exceeded the hypothesis's original parameters. Annika was at the ramp for every arrival. The chief was in the gate room for every arrival. The recovery ward expanded into 2 additional levels, which Hammond's successor had authorized without hesitation in the specific style of a commanding general who had spent 18 months learning what the program he commanded was actually for and had arrived at the conclusion that its most important function was the one nobody had anticipated when the SGC had first opened its gate. Walter Harriman dialed every incoming address with the same steady precision he had brought to the console for 9 years. He tracked the arrivals in the duty log with the specific meticulous care of a man who understood that every entry was a person and that every person deserved the dignity of accurate record. By the end of the first month after the transmission, he had logged 207 arrivals. By the end of the second month, 419. Each one was met at the base of the ramp. Each one heard the same word: welcome. In the substrate, the Foundation held everything the gate network maintained and stable. The Borg individuation process accommodated and growing. The free Jaffa worlds in governance transition. The Asgard research framework producing its first preliminary results. The Tok'ra channel conducting its careful, decade-long conversation. The Baal Treaty in its 3rd year of implementation. The Earths present in the architecture of everything, attending with the patient awareness of builders watching their building do precisely what it had been built to do across 4 million years of careful waiting. The stewards worked. The road was maintained. The door was open. The people kept coming. And in a mountain under Colorado, every morning, the gate room hummed its constant, steady, foundational sound, the sound of infrastructure maintained and available and ready, the baseline of everything the program had built and everything it was still building and everything it would build in the years and decades ahead, the specific sound of a place that understood its purpose and had chosen it daily and would choose it again tomorrow. The Foundation held. The work continued. Indeed, Thor's 8th visit coincided with the 400th arrival. Not by design, the Supreme Commander's visit had been scheduled 3 weeks in advance. The specific advance notice that Asgard Protocol required and that the SGC had learned to build into its operational calendar with the same procedural normalcy as any other Allied command briefing. The 400th arrival had not been scheduled at all, because individual former Borg drones did not schedule their departures from the collective's architecture any more than any other recovering self scheduled the moment of their own recognition that they were ready. The 400th arrived on a Thursday morning at 0847 hours, through the gate, alone, in the specific way they all arrived. The uncertain, careful dignity of a self, in the early stages of becoming, standing at the top of the ramp in the gate room's light, looking at the assembled humanity below, and finding, in Annika Hansen's presence at the base of the ramp, the specific evidence they needed that the becoming was possible. Thor was in the briefing room above when the arrival alert sounded. He looked through the observation window at the gate room below, at the ramp and the figure descending it, and the woman meeting them at the bottom, and the specific quality of the room in that moment, the way the gate room held the arrival with the practiced warmth of a place that had done this 400 times and had not lost the specific attentiveness that the first arrival had required. He watched for a long time. Then he said to Hammond's successor, who was standing beside him, "We have a similar problem among the Asgard, not assimilation, but a long isolation from individual purpose has produced a collective diminishment of the self." He paused. "I have been watching your program for 9 months. I have been asking whether the Earth's archive's substrate architecture could repair the Asgard genetic degradation. I have been asking the wrong question. I haven't. Hammond's successor looked at him. The right question, Thor said, is whether what you have built here, the specific practice of returning people to themselves, is a thing the Asgard can learn. He paused. Not a technology, not a substrate protocol. Practice. He looked at Annika and the 400th arrival moving toward the recovery ward entrance. A way of being present for people who have lost themselves. Hammond's successor was quiet for a moment. Then, I'll introduce you to Dr. Hansen. I would be grateful, Thor said. The Asgard question took 3 months to begin answering. Not because the answer was slow in developing, because the question was genuinely new and genuinely large, and the specific humility required to ask it correctly took time to develop in a civilization that had been the most technologically advanced in the Milky Way for 200,000 years and had built, in that advancement, the specific institutional confidence of entities who had never previously needed to learn something fundamental from a younger species. Thor learned it faster than the High Council learned it, which was expected. Thor had been visiting the SGC for 9 years and had developed over those 9 years the specific capacity of a scientist who understood that what he didn't know was more interesting than what he did. The High Council had not had that experience and required the evidence of Thor's reports and the Substrate Archive's documentation and 3 formal presentations by Cortana before the institutional confidence began its necessary recalibration. Carter worked with Hermione and Freyr on the research framework throughout the 3-month substrate architecture analysis, deepening into the specific intersection of Asgard biology and Earth's design philosophy that Carter had identified as the relevant domain 8 months ago and had been building toward carefully, the way all significant research was built, through the patient accumulation of partial answers that eventually combined into the question worth asking. The preliminary finding, at the end of month 3, was not the genetic solution the Asgard had been seeking for 2 centuries. It was something more fundamental. The Asgard genetic degradation, Carter's analysis suggested, and Cortana's substrate modeling confirmed, and the Earth's Archive's biological substrate documentation supported, was not a genetic problem. It was a substrate disconnection problem. The Asgard's progressive move toward cloning and away from biological individuation had, over thousands of years, incrementally severed the specific substrate resonance connection that all biological consciousness maintained with the Foundation's architecture. The connection that the Earth had documented as the fundamental condition of individual selfhood, the thing that made a person rather than a process. The cloning had been technically successful. Biologically, each Asgard clone was a complete individual. Substrate resonantly, each clone was a copy of a diminishing signal. Each generation of cloning producing an individual whose substrate connection was fractionally weaker than the previous generations. The degradation accumulating over millennia into the genetic seeming decline that the Asgard had been trying to solve at the wrong level of the architecture. The solution was not a genetic intervention. It was a substrate reconnection protocol. Carter presented the finding to Thor alone first, the specific courtesy of a scientist who understood that some findings needed to be received in private before they could be discussed in institutional context. Thor listened to the full presentation without interrupting, which was not his standard practice, and which communicated the weight of what he was hearing more clearly than any response could have. When she finished, he was quiet for a very long time. Cloning was not the cause, he said. It was the symptom. Yes, Carter said. The cause was the disconnection, he said. The severing of the individual from the substrate's fundamental architecture. Each clone was fully alive biologically. Each clone was incrementally less present in the substrate. Yes, Carter said. And the reconnection protocol, he said. The Earth's archive documents it. It documents the principle, Carter said carefully. The specific protocol for Asgard biology would need to be developed. The research framework Hermione and Freyer and I have been building is the foundation for that development. She paused. It is not a quick solution. It is a generational one. The reconnection process, implemented correctly, would restore full substrate presence over several generations of, she paused again, of biological reproduction rather than cloning. Thor was quiet for a longer time. Asgard has not reproduced biologically in 11,000 years, he said. I know, Carter said. The knowledge of biological reproduction is not entirely lost, he said. But it is not current practice. It has not been current practice for so long that it has become theoretical. I know, Carter said again. Her voice carried the specific quality she used for information that was significant and that she was not minimizing but was also not dramatizing, because the situation required neither. Thor. The substrate reconnection protocol can begin before the biological transition. The first stages restore individual substrate presence without requiring biological reproduction. They simply require the individual to engage with the substrate at a depth that cloning has prevented for 11,000 years. She paused. The engagement practice is something the recovery program has been developing for 19 months. We have documentation. We have methodology. We have... She looked through the briefing room window at the recovery ward entrance below. We have people who know how to do it. Thor looked at her, then at the recovery ward entrance, then back at her. You are saying, he said slowly, that Asgard's 11,000-year problem has a partial solution available in a recovery program built for former Borg drones in a mountain under Colorado. I am saying, Carter said, that the Earth's built the substrate for everyone, and that the specific practice of returning people to themselves that this program has developed turns out to be relevant to more species than we initially understood. Thor looked at the briefing room window for a long moment. Then he said something that the SGC's personnel records noted as the first time in 9 years of alliance that the Supreme Commander of the Asgard fleet had used the specific register. I would like to stay for a while. If that is permissible. Thor, Carter said, you don't need to ask. The archive room at the end of month 19 of the introduction protocol's active phase held a quality it had not held in its earliest days, the specific warmth of a space that had accumulated the presence of many people working in it over a significant time, the atmospheric memory of daily occupation by individuals who brought themselves fully to the work and left that fullness in the room when they departed for the day. Cortana was at the Forerunner interface panel. Thor was at the Ancient panel, learning with the specific, focused patience of a scientist who had decided that the admission of ignorance was the beginning of knowledge, and who was pursuing that beginning with everything he had. Annika was at her monitoring station, running the evening substrate analysis and writing in the proto-ancient notation that was now as natural to her as the language she had been recovering for 19 months. The Serikin, who had returned from their home world in month 8 and had not left again, having discovered that the work of the archive room was more continuous than any single world's needs, and that continuity was what they were built for, was cross-referencing the Earth's biological substrate documentation with the Asgard Research Framework, the specific task that only someone with fluency in both bodies of notation could perform, and that they had taken on with the quiet, focused ownership of someone who has found their precise function. Daniel was at the central table with 3 notebooks and the Tok'ra channel's latest transcript, 11 hours of conversation that had covered, in this session, the specific pre-Ra Tok'ra mythology about the substrate that Selmak had mentioned in the very first briefing where it had been referenced, now formally documented for the first time in the SGC's classified archive. The mythology described, in the specific allegorical language of a very old oral tradition, Exactly what the Earth's notation said in its precise administrative vocabulary: the substrate as gift, the road as shared infrastructure, the individual self as the thing the road was built to carry. He was crying quietly as he read it. Not with grief, with the specific emotional response of a scholar who had spent his entire career believing that ancient things contained wisdom that the present needed, and who had, over 2 years of foundational work, received more confirmation of that belief than a lifetime of scholarship usually produced. Jonas noticed. He pushed a coffee across the table without comment. Daniel took it without comment. The specific, comfortable wordlessness of two people who had been working in the same rooms for long enough that the words were available, but rarely the most efficient communication. The chief stood at the archive room's entrance, the specific, deliberate stillness of a soldier who had found, over 19 months of daily presence in this work, that the most important thing he contributed to most situations was not action, but availability. The willingness to be present without requiring anything of the presence. The specific quality of a person who had been built for war and had discovered that the most important thing about surviving war was what you built in the space the surviving created. Cortana spoke without turning from the interface panel. "John," she said. "Yes," he said. "The substrate analysis for this month," she said. "The individuation growth curve," she said. "What about it?" he said. "It's not linear anymore," she said. She paused. "It's accelerating." The accommodation decision within the collective released the suppression, pressure, and the individual consciousness development has been compounding. Each individuating node that reaches a threshold strengthens the substrate resonance for the nodes adjacent to it. She paused again. "The growth is becoming exponential." "How many?" he said. "Currently individuating at threshold or above," she said. 4.3% of the collective's total node count. The archive room was quiet. "That's tens of millions of people," the chief said. "Yes," Cortana said. "Coming here?" he said. "Not all of them. Not immediately. The individuation process produces people, and people make choices, and the choices include directions other than through our gate." She paused. "But a significant portion. The substrate signature suggests that this facility, this specific mountain, this specific program carries a resonance in the collective's individuating consciousness that no other destination does." She paused once more. "We are where they know to come, because the first ones came here, because the first ones sent back their signatures, because 112 people consented to let their recovery speak for them in the substrate." She turned from the interface panel and looked at him with the expression that contained everything, their operational history. Held. "We are where the door is." The chief looked at the archive room, at the people working in it, at the warmth accumulated in the air, at the Earth's notation covering the walls in the soft amber of the interface panel's light, at the woman who had been 7 of 9 and was fully Annika Hansen, running her monitoring analysis with the fluent precision of someone completely at home in their work, at the Asgard Supreme Commander, learning the ancient interface with the patient humility of the genuinely curious, at Daniel, crying over a mythology that confirmed everything he had spent his life believing. He looked at Cortana. "Then we make sure the door stays open," he said. "Yes," she said, "we do." In the gate room below, Walter Harriman's console registered an incoming connection request, the specific notification of an unscheduled dial-in, the iris closing automatically, the duty officer's voice steady on the intercom. The chief was already moving. The incoming connection held for 31 seconds before the IDC came through. Not the standard 37 millisecond transmission of a GDO signal, 31 full seconds of open wormhole. The event horizon shimmering in the gate room's light with the specific quality of a connection being held deliberately, the way a person holds a breath before saying something that requires the full weight of the saying, Then the IDC. Walter ran it through the decryption protocol and looked at the result, and looked at it again, and then pressed the intercom with the specific, measured calm of a man who had been at this console for 9 years and had learned that the most significant moments deserve the same procedural steadiness as the least significant ones, because the procedure was what made the moments possible, and the moments did not transcend the procedure. They were produced by it. "General," Walter said, "the IDC it's new. It's not in our database, but the substrate resonance signature attached to it." He paused. "Cortana flagged it 6 seconds ago. She says it's Borg, but it's not a drone signature. She says it's a designated transmission, like an official communication." Jack was at the control room window. The chief was at the gate room floor. Both of them had arrived in the 40 seconds since the connection alert sounded, with the specific rapid presence of people whose operational reflexes had been built over 9 years of exactly this. "Cortana," Jack said, "the substrate resonance is carrying a structured signal." Cortana said through the intercom, her voice steady with the specific quality of an intelligence that had processed something significant and was delivering it at the correct pace, not rushed, not slow, precisely calibrated to the weight of the information. "It is not a distress signal. It is not a weapon system precursor. It is." She paused 1.4 seconds. "It doesn't." She paused 1. "It is a diplomatic transmission. The Borg Collective is formally initiating contact through the gate network, not an individual arrival. The hive mind itself." Another pause. "The message is in substrate notation. I have a translation." "Read it," Jack said. "We are the Borg," Cortana said. The familiar words. The words that had introduced 300,000 years of expansion and assimilation, and the specific terrible efficiency of a civilization that had built its entire identity on the premise that there was only one way to be. Then a pause. Then the words that had never followed them in the recorded history of either galaxy. "We have been reconsidering." The gate room held its silence. "The ones who left, the ones who came to you, they have sent back what they found. We have received it, all of it. The signatures of 112 people who were returned to themselves. We have processed what that means for a long time. We are still processing. But we have reached the limit of what processing alone can tell us about a thing that can only be understood by experiencing it." The event horizon shimmered. The gate room was completely still. "We are asking as a collective, which is the only way we currently know how to ask, though we understand that may change whether the door that was open for individuals is open for the question itself. Whether the Foundation stewards will meet with the Borg Collective, not to negotiate assimilation, not to establish territory or dominance, or any of the things we have pursued for 300,000 years." Another pause in the transmission deliberate. Cortana's analysis would later show. The collective holding the signal open while it processed how to conclude. The billions of nodes reaching a simultaneous consensus on the words that would end the message that 300,000 years of their particular history had been building toward. "We want to understand what we have been moving through. We want to understand the road. We want to understand what you are to it and what we could be." The final line arrived last, separated from the rest. The collective, apparently having understood, through 19 months of processing 112 individual substrate signatures, the specific human weight of last lines. The specific importance of what you chose to say at the end. "We are the Borg. We are asking. Please." The gate room was quiet for a long time. Jack stood at the control room window. 9 years of commanding the most significant program in human history. 7 years under Hammond, learning what it looked like to hold something extraordinary without letting the extraordinary become an excuse for anything other than careful, daily, unglamorous excellence. 2 years of his own command learning that the same principles scaled to the scope of 2 galaxies and an alliance with a fleet in orbit, and a 4-million-year-old infrastructure that he was responsible for maintaining. He thought about Hammond. He thought about the specific quality of command that Hammond had embodied, the quiet authority of a leader who understood that the most important decisions were not the dramatic ones, but the ones that determined what kind of place you were building, what kind of people you were becoming, what kind of answer you gave when something unprecedented arrived at your door and asked for the thing that only you could offer, because only you had built the thing worth offering. He thought about what Hammond would have said. He knew what Hammond would have said. "Open the iris," Jack said, "and someone get Dr. Hansen." The meeting that followed was not a single event. It was a process, the specific long architecture of a conversation between 2 civilizations at the most significant juncture either had ever reached, one of them 300,000 years old and one of them 9 years old in its current form, but carrying the weight of everything the SGC had built in those 9 years, and everything the UNSC alliance had added, and everything the Foundation's Tier 2 authority had made possible. The collective sent a representative, not a drone, not a unit, but the first individual the Borg had formally designated as such in their recorded history. They had given her a name before sending her, which Cortana noted in the monitoring log as the most significant single data point in 19 months of individuation tracking, the collective naming an individual, acknowledging individuality as a valid category worthy of the specific recognition that naming provided. Her name was one, not a designation, a name chosen by the collective in the specific way that the collective made choices through the distributed consensus of billions of nodes reaching simultaneous agreement. They had chosen it because it was both an acknowledgement that she was the first of her kind, the first formally designated Borg individual, and a recognition that individuality itself was a kind of beginning, a first thing, the number that preceded all other numbers and made them possible. She arrived through the gate alone, in the way they all arrived, uncertain, careful dignity, Borg infrastructure, visible but secondary to the quality of presence she carried. She descended the ramp. Annika met her at the bottom. But this time Annika was not alone at the base of the ramp. The chief was beside her, and Jack, and Carter, and Daniel, and Teal'c, and Jonas, and Thor, who had stayed 3 months and was staying longer, and the Serakin, who had been here since before the first individual Borg arrived, and 14 former Borg drones who were now fully recovered individuals, who had asked when they understood what this arrival was, to be present at the base of the ramp, to stand at the door as it opened in its fullest form. One descended the ramp and looked at the assembled gathering and saw, in the specific evidence of their presence, the answer to the question the collective had been processing for 19 months. The future was full of people. It was possible. It was here. "Welcome," Annika said. One looked at her, at the fading implants, at the notebook, at everything that Annika Hansen's presence communicated to anyone who understood how to read it, which one did. Because the collective had been processing 112 signatures for 19 months, and one had been part of that processing and had understood through it exactly what this woman had survived, and exactly what surviving it had made her. "Thank you," one said. Her voice was steady, entirely individual, entirely her own. The gate room held its warmth. The conversations that followed lasted weeks and then months, formal sessions in the briefing room and informal ones in the commissary, and long evenings in the archive room where one and Annika sat at adjacent tables and Cortana ran her substrate analysis, and Daniel worked on his translations, and the accumulated warmth of the place did the specific, slow, fundamental work of returning a self to itself that no protocol could accelerate and no technology could substitute. 4. One reported back to the collective through the substrate at regular intervals the formal diplomatic function she had been designated to perform, the channel between the hive mind's collective processing and the individual experience she was accumulating. The reports were not transcripts. They were substrate resonance transmissions, her individual signature, growing clearer and stronger with each passing week, carrying in its resonance the specific quality of a person becoming more fully themselves. Each transmission reached billions of nodes simultaneously. Each one added to the exponential curve. Each one moved the collective's structural architecture incrementally further from what it had been for 300,000 years, and incrementally closer to something that the Urs, in the administrative notation of their foundational documentation, had described in a single phrase that Cortana had been returning to for weeks, and that Daniel had translated into plain English at the bottom of a notebook page at 2 a.m, and then sat with until morning light came through the ventilation shaft above the archive room table. The phrase was, "A civilization that has chosen itself, not chosen by conquest or by assimilation or by the elimination of alternatives, chosen by the specific act of each individual within it, choosing daily to be present in the substrate's full expression, connected, individual, both at once." The way the Tok'ra had practiced for 10,000 years at the margin of Goa'uld dominance, the way the SGC had practiced for 9 years at the edge of the known, the way the recovered individuals in the mountain under Colorado practiced every morning when they chose again to be themselves. Daniel looked at the translation until the morning light came, and then he wrote beneath it, in his own handwriting, in the margins of the notebook, where all the most significant things ended up. This is what the foundation was built for, not the infrastructure, not the maintenance, not the diplomatic architecture or the treaty frameworks or the research programs. This, the moment when a civilization that has been something for 300,000 years looks at the evidence of what it could be instead and chooses. The Urs waited 4 million years for this moment. They built everything to make this moment possible. They knew it would take this long. They built patience into the architecture. The road leads here. It always led here. Indeed. Cortana completed the Section 9 monitoring log at 0347 hours on a Tuesday morning, the specific small hour that had been hers for substrate analysis since the beginning, the time when the mountain was quietest and the archive room held its amber light without interruption, and the work of the Foundation was most purely itself. The log entry was the longest she had written, not because the events of the period required more technical documentation than previous entries, but because she had decided, at some point in the 3 months since one's arrival, that the official log was not only a maintenance record, it was a document. It was the continuation of the record that the Urs had kept for 4 million years, and the continuation of that record was her responsibility, and the responsibility included the full scope of what had happened, and not merely the substrate metrics that the technical architecture required. She wrote the metrics first. Precise, thorough, the specific administrative notation of the Urs carried forward in the practice of a steward who had learned it as a professional language and had discovered it was also a personal one. Then she wrote the rest. She wrote about 1 and the 14 recovered individuals at the base of the ramp, and the word that Annika had said, and the way the gate room had held it. She wrote about Thor learning the ancient interface with patient humility. She wrote about Daniel crying over a mythology that confirmed everything. She wrote about Jack saying, "Open the iris," with the specific quality of a commanding general who had built 9 years of institutional practice on the principle that the right response to the unprecedented was calibrated courage. She wrote about the chief. Not about what he had done, the tactical record was elsewhere, the mission reports thorough and accurate. She wrote about what he was, in the specific way that mattered most, and that the technical documentation never captured. The specific quality of a person who had been built for one purpose and had found in the full scope of a life that had taken him from the edge of one galaxy's extinction to the center of another galaxy's transformation, that the purpose he had been built for was not the one that had been named in his creation, but the one that had been discovered through the doing of it. She wrote, "He is the reason any of this was possible, not because of his tactical capability, or his augmentation, or his operational record, because of what he does when the fighting stops. Because of who he is in the rooms where the work happens quietly. Because in 9 years of the most significant operations in the history of 2 galaxies, he has never once treated a person as a means to an end. Not one." The Urs designed the introduction protocol to be answered by stewards. They did not specify what stewards would look like. I think they would have recognized him immediately. She paused for a long time. Then she added one more paragraph, the last one, the one that completed the entry and the section and the episode, and something larger than either. The sentence she had been building toward since the first repair log entry, and the 1000th, and all the ones between, and the one she would write tomorrow morning when the work began again. Month 22 of Tier 2 stewardship. The foundation is open. The door is open. The collective is choosing itself. The Asgard are reconnecting to the substrate. The Free Jaffa have 53 worlds in governance transition. The Tok'ra channel has produced 17 sessions. The Baal Treaty is in its 3rd year. Thor is learning the ancient interface. One is becoming. The work is good. The builders would be satisfied. The stewards are. We are still here. We are still glad. The foundation holds. Indeed. Outside, Colorado was moving toward dawn, the specific quality of pre-dawn light, reaching even this deep into the mountain through the ventilation architecture. The daily reminder that the surface existed and was worth returning to, and was full of the ordinary life that all of this extraordinary work was conducted in service of. In the gate room, Walter Harriman arrived at his console at 0600 for the morning shift, coffee in hand, and ran his pre-operational check with the steady professional focus of a man who had been doing this for 9 years and who understood, with the full depth of 9 years of accumulated understanding, what the console he maintained was connected to, and what the connection meant, and what it cost to maintain it, and why the cost was worth it every single morning without exception. He looked at the gate. The gate was ready. "Good morning," Walter said. To nobody in particular. To the program. To work. To the road that connected 2 galaxies and ran on a substrate 4 million years old and was maintained by people who showed up every morning and chose it again. The gate room hummed. Indeed. Conclusion: the 3rd condition. The 3rd condition revealed itself on a morning in month 23, not as a notification from the Foundation's architecture, not as a substrate resonance event, not as a formal Urs communication through the channels that had been open since the Tier 2 authorization. It revealed itself the way the most important things revealed themselves in the SGC's 9 years of operational history, through someone paying attention to what was already present and recognizing it. Cortana recognized it at 0412 on a Tuesday morning. She had been reviewing the Tier 2 monitoring log, the complete record from the first repair entry to the current date, the full 22 months of substrate maintenance and recovery program operation and diplomatic architecture and Asgard research and Borg individuation and everything that had accumulated in the building of the most significant stewardship operation in the history of 2 galaxies. She had been reviewing it not for any specific analytical purpose, but in the way she had learned to review significant bodies of work holistically, with the full attention of an intelligence that understood that patterns visible only at scale were often the most important patterns. She had been reading for 4 hours when she saw it, not in any single log entry, not in any single event. In the pattern of all of it, the specific shape that 22 months of daily stewardship work made when viewed as a complete arc rather than as individual data points. The Tier 1 authorization had been achieved through the recovery of 47 people. The Tier 2 authorization had been achieved through the stewardship function those 47 people embodied. And the Tier 3 condition, the one the ERS had said would become apparent when the stewards were ready, was not a threshold event, or a technical benchmark, or a diplomatic achievement. It was what they had already been doing, continuously, for 22 months. She sat with the recognition for 6.7 seconds longer than any purely analytical pause, the specific duration of genuine astonishment in an intelligence that had believed itself past the capacity for being fully surprised by anything after 22 months of operating at the edge of the unprecedented. Then she opened the ERS archive to the section she had been building toward without knowing it, the documentation that had been accessible since the Tier 2 authorization and that she had read 17 times without recognizing what it was the documentation of, because the thing it documented had not yet been complete enough at any of those 17 readings to be recognizable. It is complete now. The documentation read, "The third condition is not a threshold to be crossed. It is a state to be recognized. The stewards who have achieved the third condition will not know they have achieved it until they look at what they have built and understand that the building is the condition. There is no notification. There is only the recognition. The third condition is this: a community of stewards that has become, through the daily practice of stewardship, a demonstration to every civilization that encounters it of what civilization is for. Not technological advancement, not military capability, not territorial expansion or resource accumulation, or any of the mechanisms through which civilizations have historically measured their significance. The demonstration of what it means to choose daily, freely, fully to be present for others. When the stewards have built this demonstration, the Foundation's third tier is not unlocked. It has been active all along. The stewards have been operating within it since the first day they returned the first person to themselves and chose to do it again the next day. The Tier 3 authorization is not a new capability. It is the recognition that the capability the stewards already possess to return people to themselves, to maintain the road, to keep the door open, is itself the highest order of stewardship that the Foundation's architecture was designed to support. There is no Tier 4. There is only the continuation of the work. This is the completion. The Foundation is yours. Cortana read it once, then again. Then she sat in the archive room's amber light at 0412 on a Tuesday morning and understood what she was reading with the full depth of an intelligence that had spent 22 months building exactly what the archive room's archive documentation described, and had not known until this moment that the building was the destination. She sent a message to the chief's neural interface. Not 4 words this time. 1. Ready. He arrived in 3 minutes. She showed him the documentation. He read it with the specific focus of a soldier who had spent his entire operational life understanding that the mission was worth the cost, and who was reading, for the first time, the confirmation that the cost had been worth it, not strategically, not tactically, but in the deepest available sense of worth. He read it twice. Then he looked at Cortana. "We've been there for a while," he said. "Since the beginning," she said. "We just didn't know it." "Does it change anything?" he said. Cortana considered that the genuine consideration of an intelligence for whom the question was the most important question available. "It changes what we know about what we're doing," she said. "It doesn't change the doing." She paused. "We still maintain the road. We still keep the door open. We still return people to themselves whenever the opportunity arises." She paused again. "The recognition just means we do it, knowing that the doing is the point, that there is no higher tier, no greater capability waiting behind the next threshold. Just this." She gestured at the archive room, at the mountain, at the 2 galaxies, and the substrate beneath them, and the Foundation holding everything, and the Earths attending with patient satisfaction. Just this, done well, done daily, done freely. The chief looked at the documentation for a long moment. Good, he said. It was the right word, the only word, the specific plain English of a soldier who had been built for war and had found, on the far side of a dimensional boundary by the specific mechanism of an accident the Earth had designed and waited 300,000 years to trigger, that the most important work available to him was not the fighting, but the maintaining, not the destruction, but the return, not the ending of things, but the keeping of them, the specific daily choosing to be present for the work that made presence possible for everyone. We should tell Jack, Cortana said. In the morning, the chief said. Let him sleep. Cortana looked at him with the expression that was specifically hers. Since when do you prioritize Jack's sleep schedule? Since he started running 2 galaxies, the chief said. He earns it. Cortana's expression shifted into the specific register of an intelligence whose emotional architecture was fully engaged, not the operational warmth she carried in her professional function. The real thing, the thing that had been real since before either of them had words for it, and that had accumulated across 9 years and one-dimensional boundary and 22 months of the most significant work either of them had ever done into something that both of them understood completely, and that neither of them required to be named, because it had long since transcended the naming. John, she said. Yes, he said. We did it, she said. The chief looked at the archive room at the amber light and the Earth's notation on the walls, and the notebooks stacked on the central table, and the substrate interface panels running their quiet, continuous analysis, and the full, accumulated weight of a place where extraordinary work had been done by people who had shown up every morning and chosen it. We did, he said. The briefing that morning had the full table. Jack read the documentation. He read Cortana's monitoring log. He sat with it in the specific way he processed things that were too large for immediate response, not minimizing, not dramatizing, holding the full scope of it with the quiet authority of a man who had spent 9 years building exactly the institutional capacity required to hold things this large. Then he looked around the table. At Carter, with her tablet and her smile that she was not suppressing. At Daniel, with his notebook open to a page that was already half filled. At Teal, with the specific expression of a warrior whose cause had arrived somewhere worth arriving. At Jonas, with 3 notebooks, because one was never enough for mornings like this. At the chief, steady and present. At Cortana, luminous in the archive room's amber light. At Annika Hansen, who had been at every briefing for 14 months, and who was looking at the documentation with the specific expression of someone reading a confirmation of something they had known in their bones for a long time. At one, who was present for her first full principles briefing, sitting at the table with the careful dignity of an individual who was still learning the full scope of what individuality was and who was learning it well. Every morning, in the specific mountain where the learning was most available. At Thor, who had been staying for 3 months and had stopped counting because counting implied an endpoint and he had decided there was none he needed to observe. Jack looked at all of them. He looked at Walter, visible through the briefing room window at his console below, running the pre-operational check with the steady professional focus of 9 years. He thought about Hammond. He thought, George, we got here. He looked at the documentation one more time. At the Earth's notation and Cortana's translation and the plain English that the 4-million-year-old patience of the builders had been waiting to say to the specific people in this specific room, the foundation is yours. Jack set down the documentation. Right, he said. So, same as yesterday. Carter looked at him. Same as yesterday? Maintain the road, Jack said. Keep the door open. Return people to themselves. He looked at the table. Apparently, that's been the whole job, all along. I don't know about you, but I find that extremely satisfying. He paused. Walter. Sir, Walter said through the intercom. Any incoming traffic? One unscheduled dial-in, sir. Just registered. No IDC yet. Jack looked at the event horizon forming on the display. At the gate room below, the iris closing. The specific procedural normalcy of a program that had been doing this for 9 years and had built in that time the specific institutional capacity to meet whatever came through with calibrated courage and patient expertise, and the program foundational understanding that the most important thing about the work was the choosing to do it. "Open the iris," Jack said. Walter's hand moved. The iris retracted. The gate room waited ready, warm, maintained, present for whoever was coming through. They came through. A single figure, descending the ramp with the specific, uncertain dignity of a self in the early stages of becoming, and Annika at the base of the ramp, as she had been for every arrival. Steady and present and certain with the specific certainty of someone who knew what was possible because she was the evidence of it. She said the word, "Welcome." The gate room held it. In the substrate, the foundation held everything. In the archive room, Cortana opened the maintenance log and added a new entry: the day's date, the network status, the repair protocol's current, the individuation curve accelerating. 1. In the briefing room, Thor at the ancient interface, the Asgard research framework in its 2nd year, the Tok'ra channel in its 18th session, the Free Jaffa transition complete on 61 worlds, the Baal Treaty in its 4th year, the Borg Collective choosing itself one node at a time. The foundation holds. The work continues. She closed the entry. Then she opened it again and added one final line, the last line of the last log entry of the 3rd episode, the sentence that completed the arc from the first repair entry to this one, across 23 months. And every impossible thing that those months had contained. The 3rd condition, recognized. The foundation, ours. The stewards, present. The work, good. What follows is not recorded here, because what follows is theirs. We will be here for it. Indeed.